I'm going to share with you a study that was conducted by Eleanor, Katie McCarthy, Tom Ackerman, Chris Kurby, Raymond and myself. Narratives are typically comprised of hundreds and into thousands of individual camera shots, and filmmakers use cinematic techniques to tell stories. Uh, the research I'm going to report on today is part of a larger program of research directed at answering the question, how does cinematic form affect comprehension? And in particular, with respect to this study, our understanding of characters. Comprehension involves building a coherent mental model of narratives. And what I mean by that is as we are experiencing a narrative, we're essentially building a memory. And as each event is experienced, we are activating knowledge and generating inferences that help us understand what that event means in the context of the story and how that event is related to prior events that were conveyed in the story. There is a distinction in the literature regarding different things that could be information that could be represented in a mental model relative to the source narrative. People that have memory for the surface form, which is memory for how events are conveyed. In the context of the visual stream of a narrative film, that would be memory for shot scale, editing, lighting, and color saturation. The text base refers to memory for the events that were explicitly conveyed. And so this would be memory for the events that the filmmakers were likely intending to depict on the screen. The situation model is that aspect of the mental model that reflects the underlying narrative circumstances, what the story is about. It involves the inferences that people generate to give meaning to what they experience and understand how narrative events are situationally related. Much of the research on mental model construction focuses on the situation model because that's the basis of comprehension and our affective engagement in a narrative experience. There are different perspectives regarding the relationship between the surface features, or surface form, and the situation model. One perspective is the surface features serve to help construct the text base, but it's the semantic content of the text base that really is having the largest impact on what is represented in the situation model. There's reason to believe this perspective might be the case. Memory for the surface form is fleeting. It doesn't last very long. There's a considerable amount of research on knowledge activation during narrative experiences because that's an important process in mental model construction. And much of that research shows that the semantic content of the text base is really carrying a lot of the weight in what knowledge gets activated. There is a similar line of research on inference processes during reading, and mostly during reading and some during viewing, that emphasizes that the relationships between the explicitly conveyed events in the text base constrain the inferences that are generated. There is, however, an alternative perspective that the surface features provide processing instructions for the construction of some elements of a situation model. In this perspective, certainly the surface features are having an important impact on the understanding of the text base, and the text base is having a large impact on the information that's represented in the situation model, but surface features have non-trivial and important implications on the various aspects of the situation model. And there are reasons to believe this perspective. In the context of reading, verb morphemes have been shown to affect the understanding of narrative space and time. There's a research indicating that there are patterns of representing information in sequential visual narratives that function as morphemes, and they affect inference generation. There's research on film indicating that editing and shot scale affects our understanding of character affect, and understanding of the situational continuities of a narrative. And I just want to point out that in cognitive narratology, there are scholarly endeavors where individuals have identified systematic patterns in cinematic form that seem to co-occur with the situational structure of a narrative. In this study, we are understanding if cinematic form affects mental model construction, in particular, how viewers understand characters as agents who actively do things or as patients who experience things happening to them. This is an experimental study, and Tom Ackerman was instrumental in creating materials for this study. Tom Ackerman is a professional cinematographer and was involved in a number of commercially successful movies. He's also a professor of filmmaking. And when we were discussing with Chris Kurby material, the content that we would film for this experiment, we decided on a dance performance. There's lots of reasons for that, but we thought it was narratively neutral. But it turns out that this particular dance routine was anything but. But over a 2-day shoot, that enabled us to create 3 different versions. There's an objective version in which the camera was positioned in what Tom would call a master shot, because you can see almost the entirety of the narrative space and all the actions and events happening within that space. So most of the activities happened in the center of the screen, at least with respect to the male, but the female did move around this space a lot more than the male. We created 2 versions, an edited version that emphasized the female or the male. And this gives you a sense of the shot scales and the number of shots in these different versions. We instructed a videographer to create the male and female version by using shot scales in which the character of emphasis was in the center of the screen and you could see the person's face. The other characters sort of moving around them. And this 2-day shot enabled us to create this. Tom knew ahead of time that we were going to create a male and female version. And that's why it took 2 days to make this happen. We did instruct this videographer that people needed to understand the dance. And so you'll see high use of wide shots, which were sprinkled throughout. So you could get a sense of the activities emphasized in the tighter shot scales in the context of the larger dance routine. You'll see more shots for the female version, and that happened because the female was moving more in that space than the male, and that's what had to happen to meet our requirements. So we asked 2 research questions. How are the characters described as actors and patients in the objective version? Because this gives us a base for understanding how the text base of that dance is affecting how characters are understood in those roles. And then we did analyses to assess if those descriptions were influenced by the versions that emphasize character. And I want to make it clear that we anticipated an increase in the extent to which characters would write about, or participants would write about the characters that were being emphasized. We had college students engage in the study where they watched one of the 3 versions and engage in a think aloud task, which involves reporting whatever thoughts immediately come to mind regarding your understanding of what you're watching. And they did this at 6 locations throughout. And what you're going to see in the data is the average frequency of mentioning characters in the different roles across those 6 locations. This gives you a sense of the coding scheme involving character. So we have a much richer coding scheme than I'm able to talk about today. I'm only even talking about part of it, that which focused on character. It was inspired by Fillmore's case rule grammar, and we identify statements that mention characters. Are they described as actors, patients? We did assess internal states, physical descriptions, and the extent to which they talked about social relationship. While I'm only focusing on actor and patient, I will, in the discussion section, talk about an analysis on social relationship, because that will help explain some of the effects we find. This gives you the average number of, or average frequency of mentioning the male and female character. Female is orange, male is blue. in the role of actor and patient in the objective male and female versions. Now, I'm showing you all the data, but I'm only going to talk about the inferential statistics on this slide that pertain to the objective version. And we saw clearly a main effect where they talk about both characters as actors more than patients, which makes sense because they're actively doing things in this dance routine. But we also see an interaction where they talk about the female more as a patient than the male, and you see this slight increase in the extent to which they talk about the male as an actor relative to the female. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we think that's happening in the conclusion section. You'll see similar patterns in the male and female versions, which shows you the impact of the text base of the dance on how characters are discussed in these roles. But we do find two effects involving film version. First, we find main effects of character mentions such that, contrary to our expectation, the characters are discussed less overall in those two roles. In the female and male versions relative to the objective version. And I have what I think is a reasonable explanation for why that happened. But we also see this interaction. That main effect is qualified by an interaction where we see that there's a reduction in talking about the characters as actors in the male and female version relative to the objective version. But the reduction in the description of patients is only happening in the male version, but not the female version. So I will provide explanations for these effects as I discuss my conclusions. How are characters described as actors and patients in the objective film? Well, I want to emphasize that while we interpreted or we thought the dance would be narratively neutral, it was anything but. Participants interpreted the dance as an artifact that could be, have meaning. And in particular, they discussed the dance in terms of a social relationship between the male and female, and one in which was negative. The male was controlling the female, which is why we probably see the female being discussed more in the patient role relative to the male, and the male being slightly described more as an actor relative to the female. I want to also mention that some participants seem to talk about that social relationship as represented by the dance, and others talked about it as part of what was going on in this film. They ascribed this social relationship to the dancers. And we're doing analyses to see if that is systematically varying across version, but I don't have data to report just yet. We do find that editing and shot scale affect how characters were discussed in these roles in some surprising ways. We did not expect this decrease in how the characters are, the extent to which characters were talked about in those roles in the edited versions relative to the objective version. But when you understand a master shot and what's happening in the edited versions, I think it makes sense. And the master shot gives the viewer privy to every action that comprises that dance. As soon as you introduce tighter shot scales, emphasizing a character, you're reducing access to the activities that are being depicted. That's why we think this is happening. But when you emphasize a character that is perceived as a patient, we don't see a reduction in the extent to which people are talking about the characters in that role in the female version. So I want to show you some data that, and the frequency of mentioning the social relationships. They don't do this a whole bunch, and primarily towards the end of the film, but you see this clear effect where they're talking more about the social relationship in the female version than the male or objective version. And that might be why you don't see a reduction in talking about characters in the role of having things done to them. So we think that overall the results can convey this perspective. We know that the text base is having a huge influence on how people are talking about the characters in the role of that dance, and you can see that. However, we are finding evidence that the different versions are affecting at least the frequency at which people are talking about characters in the role. But when you have a version that emphasizes a particular role, people think about the characters more in that role because they are thinking more about the social relationships of the characters, in at least in the context of this, the materials used in this experiment. So I want to thank you, and I look forward to talking about this in the meeting.